just listening to you say it refutes itself.
Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Thanks to each of the witnesses for being here today on this important topic. Dr. Doshi, if I could just start with you. Since 2008, the McKinsey Company has done nearly $1 billion in consulting work for the United States government. $1 billion. And its top client has been the Defense Department. In fact, it's got contracts with the Defense Department, with the U.S. Department of the Navy, with the Homeland Security Department, with Customs and Border Patrol. I think in 2021 alone, McKinsey had Defense Department or other security agency contracts worth $850 million. It's absolutely extraordinary. And yet, at the same time, they're also doing business with the Chinese government. They are simultaneously taking $1 billion from the United States and its security agencies and also getting money from not just China in general, from the Chinese government and Chinese-controlled entities. Explain to us why that is a problem. I think any normal American who's sitting out there and hears that would be absolutely outraged by it, and rightly so. Why are they getting taxpayer money advising our military and simultaneously advising the Chinese military? But just explain to us, why is this a national security concern?
Well, thank you, Senator Hawley. I agree this is a national security concern. I would go further. I mean, the nature of the work that McKinsey did reportedly involved helping China consider how to outcompete U.S. technology firms, how to strengthen Made in China 2025. The goal was to help them advance their goals for technological dominance. And that is directly at odds with the interests not just of the U.S. government, but also of the corporate clients they had in the United States that they were also advising. So there's a clear conflict of interest there. And it's also, the kind of conflict of interest that even if McKinsey had exercised better judgment about the projects it took on, other firms doing business in China are getting raided by the Chinese government. Oftentimes, that means that their data is no longer secure. And if they have U.S. client data on those servers, well, that's now Chinese data. So there's a lot of concerns, I think, that we can raise here. One is the nature of the work. Another is being a vector for the transfer of information and data. And there's a third concern, too, which is that some of these firms have mutually irreconcilable obligations to the United States and to China. China is basically saying, if you want to comply with the subpoena from this committee, you can't, because we have a data security law saying you can. That's three different kinds of conflicts beyond the one, Senator, that you just identified.
Well, that's terrific. As we think about the different things that McKinsey has advised China on, they are, for example, a major proponent and promoter of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So here they are, again, taking $1 billion in contracts from the United States military, simultaneously advising China on their Belt and Road Initiative, which is meant to undermine our military and also to undermine American companies all across the world. McKinsey has advised 9 of the top 15 Chinese contractors for the Belt and Road Initiative as of 2018. I mean, it's shameless when you think about it. It is absolutely shameless. Interestingly, I recently obtained a document related to a contract, just to give one example, involving semiconductors. So semiconductors, McKinsey entered into a contract with the U.S. government, our Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, in 2021 related to semiconductors. The DoD asked McKinsey if there was any conflict that they might have with the Chinese government. According to these documents recently released to me pursuant to a FOIA request, McKinsey submitted documentation that said that there were no conflicts at all. And in fact, as we now know, they were simultaneously advising the Chinese government on a very similar project. I mean, this to me, it seems like such common sense. The chairman and I wrote to the GAO asking for an analysis of the conflict of interest law and analysis of the procurement and contract awarding process to see if there were any strictures, limitations in current law that would prevent companies like McKinsey from simultaneously making billions from the United States and making billions on China. That report has just come back just a couple of days ago. And what it shows is that there are no such restrictions in United States law currently, which is why our legislation, the Time to Choose Act, which the chairman and I co-sponsored together, introduced and passed this committee almost unanimously, I think only one no vote, is so important because it would prevent what we see on this poster behind me. Ms. Teltman, do you want to add to this why this sort of common sense set of restrictions telling consulting firms you can't consult for the U.S. government and rake in billions from American taxpayers and consult for our chief adversary at the same time, why this is important and why it's a matter of national security?
Thank you, Senator. I read that GAO report, and I join you in your concern about the lack of laws and guidance right now currently guiding contracting officials on this issue. One thing I will note is that the FAR provisions related to conflicts of interest are quite broad and could capture some of this, but most government officials won't feel comfortable taking this sort of action without greater guidance and directives explicitly giving them comfort that they can look to in taking these sorts of actions. I share similar concerns as you. I get nervous when things are too restrictive and there's too many absolutes, but you raise very good points about why contracting officials need better laws and need to be empowered to make these types of decisions.
Yeah, very good. Mr. Riley, let me just ask you, because your exchange with Senator Paul I thought was illuminating. You said that there's a continuum between banning everything on the one end and then everything goes on the other end. So I take it from your testimony today, you're on the anything goes side of the spectrum.
No.
So you support this bill then?
As I mentioned in my comments earlier, we support the goals, but we're concerned that it leads to a slippery slope, potentially. We 100% support legislation that would advance our national security and protect our national security. I will say, based on the conversation I've heard this morning, if these companies are giving China advice, either they're giving pretty bad advice or China's not taking it very well because their economy is on the downhill slide instead of going up. If there are legitimate...
Well, wait a minute. They're on the march in the Pacific. McKinsey advised them on building out islands in the South China Sea. At the same time, it was getting defense contracts. So I guess, is your position that you are opposed to, you want companies to be able to get taxpayer money from the United States and simultaneously get money from the Chinese government? That's fine?
My concern, Senator, is how do you differentiate between that, how you draw the line between that, and a soybean farmer, which depends on China for its exports and simultaneously...
The soybean farmer isn't advising the Chinese military on how to take over the United States. I come from a state where our #1 agricultural product is soybeans.
Right. And
we are a state of soybean farmers, and I can tell you, I think they would take great offense to you comparing them to a consulting firm that is taking $1 billion in money from the United States military while simultaneously advising the Chinese military on how to harm the United States. Are you saying that soybean farmers harm the security interests of the United States? I think that's a ridiculous position.
As I said, with respect to 232 national security legislation, it starts out here. The next thing you know, we're restricting trade with the UK, with Israel, with our allies.
That's not
how do you know that's not going to happen again? That's all I'm asking. We need to have guardrails to make sure that our soybean farmers and other producers aren't harmed like we have been in recent years by our trade policy.
I think that's the most, frankly, absurd instance of whataboutism. It makes just listening to you say it refutes itself.
I'm not talking about hypotheticals. I'm talking about what has actually happened, and I don't want to see that repeat.
You're talking about something that is not in this bill, and you're equating soybean farmers with a consulting firm that is advising the Chinese military. It's absolutely absurd.
I'm equating national
security. And here
security.
you are opposing, in the name of, you represented taxpayers, you are here testifying in favor, apparently, of allowing a company to take tax money. This is tax money. This is $1 billion in taxpayer money McKinsey is raking in, while also going to our chief adversary, selling our secrets essentially, and making money from them. What could be worse for the American taxpayer? I can't think of anything, which is why this bill passed overwhelmingly in this committee. And I thank you all for your testimony today. Thank you, Senator Peters, again for your hard work on this and support. I appreciate it, and thanks for holding this hearing.
Well, I appreciate your leadership on the issue as well, Senator. Senator Heston, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Paul for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for...
Ranking Member Paul, recognized for your questions.
You know, over the years, I've been an outspoken critic of socialism in general, Chinese socialism, Mao, the history of trying to get to, absolute socialism in China. I wrote a book, The Case Against Socialism. I wrote a book recently called Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up, talking about how the Chinese government encouraged this gain-of-function research, which we also funded, but also how there was a cover-up in trying to discover the cause or the origin of the virus. That being said, I'm worried about legislation that begins to ban trade with China. If you say, oh, we're going to only ban consultants that do consulting for the Chinese Communist government, we don't want them doing business with our government then. We're not going to prevent them from doing business, but they can still do it, but they lose government. The problem with that is that government's such a big consumer in our country of it, they probably will have to give up one or the other. The other thing is let's say they decided to keep doing work in China, it damages their ability in the private marketplace because you've now given them a scarlet letter. You have decided that, like the McCarthyites of old, you're going to brand them as communist friendly. This could be consulting, but, we've mentioned some big companies. Microsoft has done business, maybe a little less than they used to, but they have done business in China. So is Apple. And they agree to things that we might disagree with. We might say they shouldn't accept these things where they give the Chinese access to their data, which primarily to spy on Chinese citizens, because people buying Apple phones over there realize that all those data and all the servers are owned by the Chinese. You can disagree with it, but it really isn't any of your business. Now you can say, well, we're going to ban Apple then from doing work with the U.S. government. Half the people on this, dais have Apple phones. We're going to prevent anybody from government from having Apple phones because Apple has made this compromise to do business in China. I think that Mr. Riley mentioned the slippery slope. The slippery slope goes on and on and on, and it's, where do you end? There also is a real question whether or not, Apple that sells a lot of cell phones or McKinsey or any of these other American companies that work in China, are they being influenced by Chinese communism or worried they're going to come over here and then be a conduit to steal our stuff? McCarthy would be proud. He'd love to be part of this conversation to ban stuff, go after the communists in our government. But it's also possible that the complete opposite is true, that they actually influence the Chinese more towards American ways, that the more we do business in China, the more they see and deal with Americans on a one-to-one basis, the better it is to try to influence the communist culture. Look, we tried this in Cuba. Let's get those commies. Let's quit trading with communist China. We'll defeat the Castros. Well, guess what? It didn't work. It objectively didn't work. Over a 40, 50-year period, communism didn't necessarily thrive, but continued under the iron fist of the Castros. Trade embargoes don't work. Sanctions, frankly, don't work. And you say, well, the Chinese do all this stuff. Well, what are they doing? Are they doing it de novo out of nowhere? No, and we don't like a lot of it. Some of it is theft. Some of it's downright illegal, and we ought to do stuff about things that are illegal. If any contractor's, coordinating something that's illegal, they ought to be banned from doing business without question. Illegal. But the thing is that we put all these sanctions on China. Some of the things China does aren't de novo. They aren't out of nothing. They do it in response to things we do to them. This is the way trade wars work. It's not really been a trade war, although there's some of that now. But it's been the sanctions after sanctions. And everybody comes in from the State Department, I say, well, how are those sanctions working? Can you name me one Chinese policy where they have changed their policy because of a sanction? No, they just get annoyed with us. And they go further towards Russia and further towards Korea. That's what's going to happen from all this. Every day there's a new bill banning business with China. We still, 10% of our trade is with them. You guys want to end it? People want to end it tomorrow? You'll have no antibiotics. You won't have any pharmaceuticals. Trade is good, and we need to, I said in my opening, the average taxpayer still is saving $1,000 or $1,500 from trade with China. As you begin to ban things, as you ban consultants, there is collateral damage to these companies because you can't be a company in most of America being banned from U.S. government business because the U.S. government's a big purchaser. But also it kills your private business too. Who wants to do business with, communist-loving ex-company that does business with communists? So just, we've got to take a breath and step back from all of this. Mr. Riley, do you think it's a good idea to, end trade with China? Are there not benefits that Americans still have from trade with China?
Well, I think you can go from extremes, anything goes with no restraints, to we're stopping everything. A lot of the discussion seems to be pointing towards that we're just going to stop everything and just ban it, and somehow that's going to fix everything. I think the most recent and maybe clearest example of how these policies don't work in the way they're allegedly intended to is our Section 301 tariffs on China, which have cost the average household about $1,700 so far and counting. President Biden's U.S. trade representative studied the effects of these over 4 years and came out with a long report detailing all the ways in which China's policies, not only have they not improved, they've gotten worse. They've gotten worse. And so what do? We're adding even more tariffs on top of that. If the goal of the tariffs is to change China, we have plenty of evidence that they don't work in that regard, and I think we need to do something smarter. Probably expanding trade with our allies would be a really good step in the right direction.
Well, and see, it gets back to how do you convince people to do something you want? If you scold them or tell them not to do things, they often will do the opposite. So, for example, there was a discussion recently in China. We'd like them to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia that Russia's using in the war with Ukraine. So you think scolding them works? No, it doesn't work. They do the opposite. There are things we could trade. What we've traded is tariffs get higher, their tariffs get higher. Well, we could offer to lower some of the tariffs on their goods in exchange for better behavior. That would be a transaction. That would be we give you something, you give us something. But instead, everything is about ending trade, stopping business, more sanctions. You're going to keep getting the same response. You want better relations with China, or you just want to end it all? You can end it all. It'll be a disaster for everybody. Or you can say, how does it work? Do we do more sanctions? Do we yell at them? Do we travel to their country and scold them? Or do we say, be very quietly when we're in their country, hey, what about we might reduce some of our trade barriers, some of our sanctions, if you'll do X? You'd get a lot more with honey than you will with vinegar. And this is a big trade, and I mean a big issue, and bigger than even this particular panel. But we have to have these discussions, and it's go on and on, because every day there's a new bill that bans trade and bans companies from China. Many of these employ Americans in my state and other states, and we need to get away from this protectionism and remember what Bastiat said: when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Thank you.
Senator Heston, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Paul for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for providing your testimony and expertise on this topic. Dr. Doshi, I understand you are here stepping away from parental leave, that you have a brand new baby, so we are appreciative of you taking the time, and congratulations on your expanding family. That's wonderful. I'm going to ask questions, some of which have been touched on earlier, but I just wanted to kind of get into a dialogue with all of you on some of these issues. And I'm going to start with you, Dean Tillotman, following up on a line of questions that I understand Senator Peters asked you about. McKinsey & Company, a well-known consulting firm, advised Purdue Pharma on how to influence the Food and Drug Administration's process for evaluating drug safety, while at the same time advising the Food and Drug Administration on how to evaluate the safety of the powerful opioids produced by Purdue Pharma. In 2022, the President signed into law the Bipartisan Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisitions Act, which Senator Peters and Grassley, Ernst, and I introduced to strengthen federal protection against conflicts of interest in response to McKinsey's really egregious behavior. We are pushing the federal entity responsible for implementing this bill to take swift action to fully implement it as soon as possible. Once it is fully implemented, how will this law help prevent private companies from exploiting their relationships with federal agencies to benefit their other clients, as we saw McKinsey do with the Food and Drug Administration and Purdue Pharma?
Thank you, Senator. At a baseline, it's going to help inform them that this is, in fact, a conflict of interest. I think prior to this hearing, there was confusion even among the procurement community that a commercial conflict could create the type of organizational conflict of interest that we're concerned about. So the hearing alone brought attention to the fact that the law is broad but needs to be broader, and there needs to be additional guidance and directives for the contracting community to make these determinations. But more importantly, it needs to put contractors on notice that these types of conflicts are not acceptable. They need to put compliance programs in place to better disclose these types of conflicts of interest so that procurement officials can make educated, informed business decisions about this and how best to either mitigate the risk or, frankly, avoid contracting with those entities in the first place.
Look, I mean, from my perspective, as somebody whose state has been extraordinarily hard hit early on by the opioid epidemic, the notion that any entity would serve both the FDA and Purdue Pharma on this issue just is extraordinary. And I expect when somebody contracts with the federal government that they will put the people of the United States' interests first. And that's very hard to do when you are also talking to the very manufacturer who, through lies and greed and malevolence, have harmed so many people. So I thank you for the feedback, and we'll continue to work on it. Dr. Doshi, following up on this same question, because of congressional oversight that we did, the Food and Drug Administration no longer contracts with McKinsey because of McKinsey's work for Purdue Pharma. However, several other federal agencies continue to work with McKinsey in other capacities. For example, the Department of Defense recently awarded 2 exclusive contracts to McKinsey, including to evaluate the Army's ammunition supply chain and provide advice to the Space Force. We also know that McKinsey contracts with the Chinese government, again, following up on Senator Hawley's line here, and advise the Chinese on how to develop an intimidating military presence in the South China Sea. Does it concern you that the U.S. continues to work with McKinsey despite this track record? Do you think it is in the best national security interests of the United States to continue contracting with McKinsey?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think that it's important for this legislation to be widened to address exactly the question that you've raised. One is that it's not just a question of whether they contract with the Department of Defense. It's a number of federal agencies that are going to contract with these consulting firms. All of that should be, considered. The second thing that I'm worried about is not just our consulting firms that are doing contracting with the federal government and the Chinese government. It's our technology service providers, because the U.S. government relies on these technology service providers for critical services. The Department of Defense, our defense industrial base, our water sector, our power sector, transportation, telecommunications. So if we have a conflict of interest where those companies go to China, share their source code, or enter into a joint venture which can compromise that service, it affects all of us. So I do have a concern, Senator, to address your question directly with that ongoing work, and I think that concern could apply to other companies as well.
Thank you. Another question for you, Dr. Doshi. As part of last year's National Defense Authorization Act, some Department of Defense contractors will now be required to certify that they do not have similar contracts with China or other foreign entities. Once the Department of Defense fully implements this law, it will provide additional safeguards against conflicts of interest that compromise our national security. How could Congress expand this requirement to agencies other than the Department of Defense? Are you concerned about workarounds or waivers that can undermine the intent of this law?
Well, thank you, Senator. I am concerned about the possibility that if the legislation were written in such a way, or if contracting guidelines were scoped in such a way that companies could find loopholes, then that would be disastrous for us. Again, when it comes to technology service providers, the stakes are so high that we want these companies to think from a risk perspective that the risk of partnering with the PRC or working with the PRC or giving in to their demands is not going to be worth it, given the significant revenue hit that they'll take from being cut off, not just from the Department of Defense, but a number of U.S. government agencies. So I want that balance to be in a more conservative direction.
Thank you for that. Last question, and it's to Dean Tillotman. Earlier this year, in violation of U.S. law, consulting companies McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, M. Klein & Company, and Teneo, all of whom are based in the United States, initially refused to comply with subpoenas issued by the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Those subpoenas sought information on the relationship between these companies and the Saudi Arabian government's attempts to influence U.S. policy. While refusing to comply with our subpoenas, these companies chose to follow a ruling from a Saudi court rather than follow U.S. law. It is outrageous that these companies, and let's be clear, they're American companies. They benefit from being able to be based in the United States with all the privileges and opportunities that brings to citizens and to businesses. It is outrageous that they are profiting off of their deals with the Saudis over protecting the national security interests of the United States. Simply put, if you want to contract with the U.S. government, the world's largest buyer of goods and services, then at a bare minimum, you need to comply with U.S. law, which includes complying with subpoenas from Congress. How can Congress or the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council make clear that U.S. law supersedes the law of a foreign country in the event of a conflict between U.S. and the law of the foreign country, especially in cases involving federal contractors that work with our adversaries?
I think you put your finger, Senator, on the complexities of multinational companies and doing business with many countries at the same time. I do not have a significant amount of faith that the FAR Council, who is involved with very talented people, could come to an exact solution for that precise problem. But I think you've put your finger also on the fact that this is what occurs when you have contractors encountering these competing interests. There, you have to basically, I mean, there's a reason that you've named the bill Time to Choose, right? And so I think this is one of the inherent problems with empowering this type of activity. And I think it's why, as the FAR Council continues to hopefully and more speedily consider these issues, it will come down with some more guidance about what a contracting official should be considering. But B, I'm not sure I would empower a contracting official to speak directly to the issue that you raise. But I do agree with you that if companies want to benefit from doing business with the United States or benefit from doing business at all in the United States, that this needs to become a priority.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.